kind of seen as kind of the epicenter of De Blasio's affordable housing plan, where they built significantly sized subdivision of affordable housing, right? That's almost exclusively black. And of course, this is affordable housing that is not anywhere near wealthier white areas, right? So in that way, they kind of block that housing from being integrated into wealthier neighborhoods. This practice, of course, is not really legal, right? But the Department of Housing and Urban Development officials are kind of loath to enforce it because of how deeply unpopular it would be to do so. Okay. There is active discrimination by realtors. Okay, this is the other. So Newsday, and many of us have probably already looked at this. Y'all had to read it, but many heard about it probably a couple of years ago. So Long Island newspaper Newsday did an expose. They did an audit study, and they found that in 40% of their tests, okay, minority testers received disparate treatment compared to their different treatment compared to their white counterparts. So an audit study is when you send in, let's say that you send in different home buyers with potential home buyers as testers, who they all may have generally identical qualifications. But they might be racially different. So say a black home buyer and a white home buyer with identical applications, except for the name and the picture of them on their applications or whatnot, are sent to different realtors. And it turned out that the black testers were discriminated against 49% of the time. Latino testers were discriminated against 39% of the time, and Asian testers, who oftentimes we don't think of as receiving discrimination in housing, Asian testers were even discriminated against 19% of the time. In the most egregious cases, realtors even refused to show properties to minorities unless they met stringent financial requirements, like pre-qualification letters from their banks, and of course these were requirements that were not imposed on white testers, right? So discrimination. What is another form of discrimination is racial steering, or what we oftentimes describe as discrimination with a smile. Realtors are friendly, where realtors are very friendly, but covertly what they do is they steer customers in ways that perpetuate racial segregation. So that same 2019 audit study by Newsday showed that minority testers were typically steered towards predominantly minority areas, while white testers, and this is just on Long Island, just like now, right? White testers were steered towards predominantly white areas. Minority testers were typically shown fewer homes than their white counterparts, and only homes in minority areas of Long Island. Frequently, white testers were encouraged to observe things like school buses, public bus stops, and local drugstores to ascertain the racial makeup of an area. Okay, so so here's some commentary. This is what racial steering looks and sounds like, right? So the realtor might say to the potential home buyer, to a potential white home buyer or whatnot, there are a lot of, might say, I'm not racist, but there are a lot of Latinos living in that neighborhood. I'm not supposed to be telling you that, but you have a daughter and I like you, right? So there's an implication that say that Latino area, area with lots of Latinos, would not be a safe area for this potential home buyer and their daughter. I would, someone else would say, I would not recommend this particular area because it's totally black, and I don't like area B because it's pretty mixed, right? So this is pushing that potential white home buyer toward a racially homogeneous neighborhood. A third is like black people do live around here, but it hasn't gotten bad yet, right? So the implication is that it could in the future get bad, and that is by virtue of black people living in the neighborhood, right? So there are a lot of blacks who live there, but that's up to you, right? These are kinds of quotes, actual quotes from previous study in 2000. Okay, but let's see what that looks like today. So this is commentary from 2019 from the Long Island divided study that we read, where a Coldwell banker, residential broker, was talking to a white tester, and who, of course, they did not know that this person was a researcher, right? They just thought they were a potential home buyer, and they said, wherever you're going to buy, wherever you're going to buy diapers, during the day, go at 10 o'clock at night and see if you like the area. There was one fellow who would insisted on this house, and the wife was pregnant and had one and had a little one. And I said to him, I can't say anything, right? So the realtor is implying, like, I can't say anything. It's wrong for me to say, but this is secret knowledge. But I encourage you. I want you to go there at 10 o'clock at night with your wife to go buy diapers. Go to that 7-Eleven. They don't, they did, of course, the realtor says, of course, they didn't buy there. I have to say it without saying it. In other words, this person, the realtor is saying it without saying it, that you don't, to go and check out places where, to like the local store to see if there are minorities there. Right. What I see, the same realtor said, what I say is always to women, follow the school bus. That's what I always say. Follow the school bus. See the moms that are hanging out on the corners. In other words, to check out what is the racial makeup of the local school, is to follow the school bus and see who are the other mothers who are waiting on the corners for the school buses with their kids. Right. Okay, so these are all ways of warning potential home buyers about the racial makeup of the neighborhood without actually saying it. There are other forms, moving forward, there are these new forms of unofficial redlining by, by banks, right? So the way that banks oftentimes calculate risk favors investment in segregated white areas, because residential change or in other words, integration is seen as risky unless the neighborhood is clearly gentrifying, right? So the mixed neighborhoods tend to receive the least amount of mortgage investment, right? So, and this is mixed neighborhoods. Oftentimes we think of mixed neighborhoods as kind of ideal, right? But that is not the way that banks tend to see that. Black neighborhoods receive less total mortgage capital than socioeconomically similar white neighborhoods. So it's not about the wealth of the neighborhood, right? It's not about the wealth of the neighborhood. It's about the racial composition of the neighborhood. Blacks and Hispanics receive less private credit and fewer home improvement and are approved for fewer home improvement loans. And one might say that, well, that is because they tend to have poor credit. Of course, that is also a function of their racial discrimination. Unofficial redlining, or through insurance companies. So no insurance, if you don't have any insurance, then you don't get a mortgage, right? Then you can't get a mortgage. And if you can't get a mortgage, then of course you can't get a house. Studies of insurers found that Blacks and Hispanics were routinely refused insurance or offered inferior policies and charged higher premiums. It's shown that Blacks and Latinos are typically required to show more documentation, such as like a house inspection or their credit history, in order to get insurance for their homes, and they're also held to more stringent maximum age and minimum policy size requirements, right? Thereby increasing the cost of the policy. Right, and also reducing the likelihood of, say, if one is older, and reducing the likelihood that one might be able to get a policy, right? So there's a strong association between zip code, and racial composition, and the price and number of insurance policies written. Predatory inclusion, and so pay close attention to this. According to Princeton political scientist Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, liberal policymakers of the 70s, they sought to increase Black home ownership, right? But they continued to assume that Black home buyers were inherently risky investments, right? So they wanted to increase this home ownership, but they saw home buyers as increasingly risky. So what did they do? So minority borrowers and communities are no longer totally excluded from mortgage credit, right? Because they encourage, they pass policies to encourage, mortgage lenders to to lend to include African Americans, but they were all but they were typically included on unequal terms. Today, Black neighborhoods receive more subprime. Okay, subprime loans tend to be either variable rate or they have inferior terms, much higher interest rates and things like that than white neighborhoods. Blacks and Hispanic applicants are often targeted by for inferior loan products, charged higher fees, provided less counseling and assistance, right? And so, but why is this the case, right? Well, racial segregation and direct discrimination makes underserved minorities more vulnerable to exploitation. Thus, instead of being excluded, right, as they were before, today minority home seekers are often included, but included in predatory ways, in ways that exploit their vulnerabilities. Okay, so I'm going to shift. I'm going to shift. Like I said, I know that this is a very long lecture. If you got to roll, then you got to roll. But I'm going to continue. So I'm going to shift focus and talk about this time of the 1970s and urban restructuring. Say that white flight to suburban areas beyond the jurisdiction of municipal taxes and job flight due to deindustrialization and outsourcing. That's the urban crisis. During the 1970s, cities like NYC experienced fiscal crises during which they were forced to reduce services, increase taxes and fees on already poor populations. Urban governing regimes sought to recover. They sought to recover by making cities attractive to tourists, suburbanites, and businesses. Okay, so this is, so we're moving towards talking about gentrification, right? So we're going to talk about the back to the city movement. In the United States, large numbers of former suburbanites have moved back into cities, right? Either the suburbanites themselves or the kids of those people who moved out to the suburbs are moving back into cities, right? They're attracted by high-end service sector employment, right? Remember the dual labor market? Right, they're oftentimes those high-end service sector jobs, like Google or something like that, are located within the city. Okay, booming real estate markets, right? Because other people are moving back into the city, and this is making the real estate market. This is setting it on fire and making urban real estate a good investment. Increased perceptions of safety and security, and we're going to talk a lot about that next week. We're going to talk a lot about that one next week. City services catering to middle class and elite tastes, right? So increasingly so. And there's also a kind of perceived coolness and grittiness of urban life that today that maybe didn't have the same cachet in the 1970s, maybe in the 1970s and the 1980s. This back to the city movement is actively courted by city governing regimes. Okay, so of course we're going to talk a lot about gentrification, which is a term coined in 1964 by British sociologist Ruth Glass to describe the influx of middle-class people to cities and neighborhoods, displacing poor working-class residents, right? So, okay, this is coming from the root word gentry, meaning like the upper class, right? The movement of the gentry back into cities and neighborhoods and displacing poor and working-class residents. Gentrification is the socioeconomic transformation of urban neighborhoods involving the influx of more affluent, oftentimes white, residents and businesses that increase the local property values and the cost of living. The new investment alienates and oftentimes leads to the displacement of poor, often non-white residents, right? And of course, remember, the reason why that's the case is because those are the same areas that were formerly disinvested and generally and primarily minority. The process is often encouraged by local political and economic elites who see it as an opportunity for new investment and a way of cleaning up formerly disinvested areas. Right? We hear this term "cleaning up," and we should think immediately, for those who might have any kind of memory of this, immediately think about the era of Rudolph Giuliani in New York City. We're going to say more about that next week. So, a little bit of theory. So CUNY geographer Neil Smith, who passed away a few years ago, he theorized in the late 1970s that gentrification would occur when the value of a space as it's currently utilized, like the value of any of a house or an area with the way, or a building, the way it's currently utilized, is exceeded by its potential value if it's used in some other way, right? So, in other words, if maybe an old warehouse that's not being utilized it's not being utilized anymore, is turned into luxury lofts, right? So that space, the value of that space, it can be increased by changing the use of that space, right? And the difference between the current rental price and the potential rental price of a property is what's called the rent gap, right? So urban real estate speculators, they search all over urban areas. They search throughout the world, oftentimes, in search of seeing where potential rent gaps are, where they could, say, repurpose an area in some sort of way as to increase its value and make lots of money, right? And they oftentimes seek to restructure urban spaces so as to maximize potential profits, right? So not only are they looking for rent gaps, but if you restructure urban spaces, you can create rent gaps and thereby create the opportunity for making money. Under capitalism, the value of real estate is determined by the demand for the use or access to that space. So in the late 20th century, white flight and capital flight from the U.S. urban areas reduced the value of urban space and increased the value of suburban space, right? So that's because white flight was heavily subsidized and abetted by the federal government. Real estate speculators capitalize on increasing residential segregation by exploiting Black renters and home buyers who had limited access to housing markets, right? So they could charge more rent in an area because Blacks couldn't move anywhere else, right? They could do things like that. They could charge higher home buyer fees and things, right? And also, they could also make lots of money by capitalizing on white demand for racially exclusive suburban housing, right? So they're making money hand over fist from Blacks who can't move anywhere else and from whites' desire to move as far away from Blacks as they can, right? The declining value of inner city spaces during this urban crisis created opportunities for investors to buy and redevelop land cheaply. Okay, by redeveloping and rebranding poor minority areas using tax incentives to corporate investment and evicting minority residents, speculators could generate new demand for urban space from wealthier and whiter groups. They could further capitalize on the misery of displaced. More on this one later. They could further capitalize on the misery of displaced residents through a highly privatized criminal justice system. And we're going to talk a lot about that in a couple of weeks. So what does a typical gentrification process look like? Low property values, right? And so this stemming from, say, like the urban crisis, right? That lowered property values. Lower property values allow the city to take them over, or developers to begin to buy them up, right? So we saw in the documentary from a couple of weeks ago, we saw in that documentary about the Bronx's burning, how after the real estate values declined, they were bought up. That same real estate was then bought up by real estate speculators, by big firms, and they called that rebuilding the Bronx, right? The cities rezone areas to allow more residential units, right? Young people like students and artists began renting places in low rent neighborhoods. So you might think of, say, like at one time Bushwick, right? But increasingly, you might see like Bed-Stuy is turning into an area like that. Neighborhoods are rebranded, right? So like Soho or the Piano District, Soho from early on from the 1970s, and the Piano District of today, which is the lower the South Bronx. Part of the South Bronx is being remade as the Piano District. Cafes, restaurants, art galleries, and clubs cater to the tastes of wealthier patrons, and that can be seen in place in formerly factory areas like Dumbo, and also in places like Greenpoint, and also and in Bushwick. And more affluent residents become familiar with the area and begin moving there. So that's the way we typically think about gentrification, right? But but of course, it's experienced in different, in differently in different, depending on one's position, right? So there's a building level process, right? That renters might experience, where landlords offer money to tenants with rent stabilized leases, right? So the landlord might offer a tenant $10,000 to leave the unit versus, and of course that might sound really good if, let's see, instead of if the renter is poor, right? And maybe having to pay more money, right? Landlords we see in gentrifying areas will harass their tenants, right? They'll call them, they'll send agents by, and use other mechanisms to attempt to enter apartments to discuss the tenant moving out, because they want to push low income folks to move out, because then they can maybe renovate the apartment and rent it to somebody who can afford to pay more. Landlords will oftentimes do things like deliberately destroy apartments or mess things up. They'll do things like turn off the heater, won't turn it on, and so everybody should know the heat laws in New York City for private rental units. Your landlord should be turning on the heat as of October 1st. Turning off heat, or they turn off heat in the wintertime. They cut off water, refuse to make repairs in order to force tenants to move out. They exploit tenant ignorance. They tell the tenant that their lease is up, even though they might have a right to renewal, right? Or new landlords, will oftentimes, so a lot of times, old school landlords will have everybody on month-to-month leases, right? And of course, once they sell the building and the lease is only month to month, then that can give them the opportunity to push out their tenants and move in people who can pay more, right? There's also a neighborhood level process of gentrification, where investors who are looking to make, and so one was the building level process, and then there's the neighborhood level process, where investors who are looking to make quick money, they buy buildings in order to flip them, right? So many folks are familiar with that kind of process. And some investors will offer cash payments to homeowners, up front for their buildings, right? There was a company called MySpace. That would go into gentrifying neighborhoods and look for older minority homeowners, right? And they would offer them money for their homes, right? Upfront cash, and oftentimes people on fixed incomes would take the money and sell their homes, right? Real estate firms start to promote neighborhoods even before the neighborhood is completely flipped. They'll start to promote neighborhoods with new names like Nolita, right? Or North of Little Italy, or Jack Heights instead of Jackson Heights, right, to make it sound cool and hip, or the Piano District to play on the neighborhood's history in order to make it sound cool, and to deflect from the fact that the neighborhood is primarily Black and Latino, right? Businesses, so typical gentrifying small businesses eventually lead to larger chains, right? Rezoning, where real estate firms and financial institutions call for the city government to change zoning from industrial to residential, especially, and this is a link that y'all should check out, especially waterfronts and former factories that have become loft apartments, right? So we've seen major waterfront rezoning and rezoning in the past few years along in Williamsburg and along the Brooklyn waterfront, right? We've also seen the major rezoning of downtown Brooklyn, right? And now many of the those new high-rise towers in downtown Brooklyn are residential towers because they changed the zoning, right? So this, one oftentimes people claim, defenders of gentrification or apologists for gentrification claim that gentrifying areas, that gentrification is good because it leads to more demographically diverse areas. And to the degree that those areas are more demographically diverse, it leads to another phenomenon oftentimes called intimate segregation. So researchers point out that even though gentrified neighborhoods are sometimes more diverse, they remain internally divided according to race, class, and ethnicity. In other words, people may live in the same neighborhood, but they don't interact in meaningful ways. They oftentimes use very different spaces. So there might be the local bar where older head residents might hang out versus the new hipster bar where maybe the new gentrifying residents might hang out, right? Or bodega, bodega coffee, like at your local bodega versus the craft coffee at whatever coffee house has opened up in the area. In addition, this oftentimes leads to increased tension within the neighborhood. A good example would be like dog parks in gentrifying neighborhoods, or gentrifiers kind of taking over access and controlling access to things like local playgrounds. Right. In addition to displacement, the notion of intimate segregation makes us question the claim that gentrification leads to diversity. Gentrification is also a global process, right? As populations around the world urbanize, urban real estate has become an even larger and more powerful force in the global economy, right? So global investors, not just U.S. investors, and speculators purchase urban real estate as investment property and also tax havens, right? Which inflates prices, right? You can see this is a phenomenon that is a big in New York City, right? Where those big time luxury apartments that are caught in the big buildings that go for like $30 million for an apartment and $50 million for an apartment. It's like, who's buying that? Because oftentimes those properties remain vacant, even though they are owned by somebody, right? These turn out to be really, really good places for a global elite to hide their money. Owners intentionally will keep those properties off the market to inflate demand, right? The market value of urban space, so this inflates prices, and it also inflates demand in areas where housing stock might be made artificially low. The market value of urban space rises beyond what poor and working people can afford, and therefore poor and working people in areas are displaced from newly desirable spaces and pushed to the urban periphery, if not out of the city completely, right? City government. So this is another term. City is growth machine. We've seen it before, and so I'm going to repeat it. City government priorities changed in the 1970s and the 1980s, and they began to promote the city as a place to play for like tourists. Right? They began building things like stadiums and convention centers in hopes of attracting attracting tourists and folks like that, and gentrifiers. Right? In the era of the Great Divergence, city governments have worked hand in hand with financial elites to promote gentrification, right? So it's not just something that happens. City planners and city governments actually promote gentrification, right? They are all about economic growth, right? Because gentrification leads to economic growth, and this idea that the purpose of a city is for economic growth. This is the attitude of many of these urban elites, that it's for economic growth, and therefore the idea of the city is a growth machine, right? With this attitude, city officials and urban elites push for zoning changes and infrastructural improvements and neighborhood renaming and all sorts of other kinds of practices in order to promote economic growth. The problem is that economic growth does not necessarily mean better living standards or better living standards or conditions or something affordable for poor and working class residents of the city. Okay. And finally, the last slide, from primitive accumulation to accumulation by dispossession, right? So those are two terms that we're going to kind of juxtapose to one another. German economist Karl Marx argued a long time ago that in the first instance, capital accumulation is achieved through the literal taking of land from peasants, right? This was before we learned that this was called the enclosure movement in the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe. And indigenous people, right? And indigenous people through, of course, this is imperialism and colonialism, which is then that dispossessed land is then claimed as the private property of elites or landlords who, because it's their private property, they determine the use of that property, and they determine who has access to it, and therefore landlords. In fast forward through the contemporary day, another CUNY geographer, David Harvey, argues that capital regenerates itself, right? So capitalism regenerates itself through the dispossession of land and wealth from those who are less powerful. It is accompanied by largely through the privatization and commodification of public property, right? So we can see from primitive accumulation to this accumulation by dispossession, the process of gentrification, or the dispossession of poor and working class people. Through law and through finance, and the appropriation of that land into the hands of landlords, right? Okay, and we're going to talk a lot more about public space and public property next week. But that concludes today's lecture. I'm glad that a number of y'all stuck with us through the lecture, and that will end it there. Okay, I'm going to stop recording. Now, okay, and since I stopped recording, I'll actually stop sharing. Are there any questions before? I appreciate y'all's hanging out for the duration. Are there any questions going forward about anything in the class that you needed to ask me? Remember that the review sheet is up on Blackboard now. You have access to it, and also there will be a review session in the discussion sections this week. I am guaranteed to have a review session on Wednesday evening at 6:30 p.m. Okay, so look out for that. You can, have fun and join. And also the midterm exam will be on the 25th through the 31st. Let's see, I got one question. What if we go to your review session? Does it count toward a discussion section too? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. It does count as a discussion section. So they're just regular discussion sections. I'm just doing a review for the midterm. Sounds good? All right. So I will see y'all later. All right, I'm shutting it down now. Peace out, y'all.